Hi everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to Environmental Health Australia's Earth Day live chat event to celebrate the 51st anniversary of Earth Day. My name's Samantha, the National Communications Officer for EHA, and it is my pleasure to be hosting this event today. Our EHA National President, Philip Swain, sends his apologies for not being able to host today. He's unfortunately out in remote Western Australia and does not have reception. He would, however, like to pass on his thanks to our fantastic speakers for participating today. Earth Day is an annual event that demonstrates support for environmental protection and has evolved to include a wide range of events coordinated globally by earthday.org, with the support of over 1 billion people in more than 193 countries. The theme this year is Restore Our Earth and draws attention to climate change and the effects it's having on our planet and our health. Today, we'll be hearing from some fantastic environmental health and climate change professionals. Open up the questions for 5 minutes after each speaker's presentation. To ask a speaker a question, simply type a comment below. You're welcome to comment at any time, and questions will be answered at the end of the speaker's presentation. Our first speaker joining us is Dr. Alana Hansen, an adjunct senior research associate in the School of Public Health at the University of Adelaide. She completed her PhD in 2010 at the University of Adelaide, where she conducted research on climate change and health with a focus on vulnerable populations. Welcome, Dr. Hansen.
Hello, thank you, Sam, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to everyone today on Earth Day. Could I have the first slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so my talk today is on the impacts of climate change on environmental health and the recent research that has been conducted at the University of Adelaide in the School of Public Health. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So as a bit of a background, I think we all know the detrimental effects that climate change is having on the Earth, but not everyone associates the effects of climate change and the impacts on health. And these are both direct and indirect. So the direct effects, I think we can put down to things like heat stress and injuries and deaths that are caused from severe weather events. We all know that there will be more storms and floods and droughts, and these have effects on our health, both physically and mentally, of course. The indirect effects of health, these can be foodborne and waterborne diseases, and vector-borne diseases can increase, and also so can air pollution. And the effects of air pollution on our health is well documented, and some of the pollutants of particular note with climate change are aeroallergens, particulate matter, and ozone. So today I'll be talking about some of the research that's been conducted in public health at the University of Adelaide since I've been associated in the school, and that's been about 15 years. Thank you. Next slide, please. So air pollution was some of the work that I did in my PhD, and we know that particulate matter is associated with cardiovascular hospital admissions, which increase on days, particularly of days of high dust and smoke. So in dust, there's high levels of PM10, and the smaller particulate matter particles, PM2.5, are particularly high in smoke. And we found this on days of bushfire smoke in particular. And some other research has been done by other members of the team, and they found that asthma hospital admissions in children are linked to days where there's high ozone in the warm season. And so we know that when temperatures increase, ozone increases, and we know that when there's bushfires and dust storms, particulate matter increases. So we expect that with climate change, there will be worsening air quality. Next slide, please. So we also know that foodborne diseases increase in higher temperatures. And this slide shows you a graphic, not from our team, but from ANU. And I think you can see here the clear relationship between temperature and salmonella notifications. So temperature is the dark line there, and salmonella notifications in the pink. And you can see that there's a clear association there. So Dr. Adriana Milazzo in our team has done a PhD specifically looking at Salmonella and Campylobacter and the association with high temperatures. And amongst her work, she also did a survey among cases of Salmonella and Campylobacter, and found that these cases, she investigated their knowledge and attitude towards food safety, and she found that there was unsafe personal and food hygiene practices and unsafe food preparation practices. And also the people had poor knowledge of foods associated with increased risk of foodborne illness. I think this is really worthwhile knowing about when we're looking at how to prevent some of these foodborne diseases in summer. And this is also going to be a problem, of course, when our temperatures increase. Could I have the next slide, please? So we know that Salmonella species are temperature sensitive, and that increasing temperature is likely to increase the burden of salmonellosis. Some work was done by Dr. Ying Zhang in our department, and she looked at the effect of weather on cases, and she found that temperatures and relative humidity and rainfall positively correlated with case numbers. And she also looked at heat waves and found that there was a 34% increase in the risk of salmonella, particularly when temperatures were greater than 41 degrees. And this, of course, leads us to assume that salmonella infections may increase with climate change. And this also varies, the risk can vary by location. And so in subtropical regions, that risk is going to be greater. Thank you. Next slide, please. We also know that increasing temperatures, increasing rainfall are going to affect vector-borne diseases. So some of the vector-borne diseases that we've looked at in our research include Ross River virus and dengue fever. The dengue we looked at in China in particular. It's a bit of a different situation there. There's a very increasing, growing migrant population, internal migrant population in China. And we found that this and changes in the landscape, the increasing urbanisation and the changing climatic conditions do increase the risk. But here in Australia, Ross River virus is Australia's most prevalent vector-borne disease, and cases occur more frequently in summer and autumn. And one of our PhD students has been doing some great work looking at the statistical analysis between the associations between the case numbers in South Australia and the weather conditions. And she found that vector populations, the mosquito populations and rainfall are important factors associated with transmission of the disease. She also found that a geographic expansion in the area of cases in South Australia, and this is consistent with what we expect with climate change, with changing conditions so that the temperature increases, and so areas that perhaps were not suitable for transmission of these diseases are now suitable. So the range where these diseases are going to occur is broadening. And in South Australia, the highest risk is along the River Murray. Can I have the next slide, please? So I guess most of the work that I've been associated with over the past 15 years or so has been looking at the effects of heat on health. And this was part of my PhD, and it has certainly expanded into my work since that time. So initially we were looking at the effects of heat waves on morbidity and mortality, and we found that ambulance call-outs and hospitalisations and emergency department visits increase with extreme heat. And when we looked at cause-specific morbidity, we found that in particular, persons with mental health problems presented at hospitals more during days of extreme heat and heat waves. Renal disease presentations increased, and also perhaps, as we would expect, people with heat-related illnesses. In 2008 and 2009, there were some intense and unusual heat waves in South Australia, and the 2009 heat wave also extended to Victoria, and you'll remember that that was associated with the severe bushfires that occurred there in 2009. So looking at the data, the health data associated with those events, we did some statistical analysis, and we identified some vulnerable populations, and this of course included older people, and it was also extended to migrant populations, people in rural communities, and workers. We also looked at risk factors, and we've done some climate change adaptation studies as well. Next slide, please. We also looked at the effect of heat, excuse me, on occupational health and safety. And we've had two researchers in particular who've dedicated a lot of time to looking at work-related injuries and illnesses, and using workers' compensation claims data from Safe Work SA and also WorkSafe nationally, we found that these claims increase at higher temperatures. This graph here shows you that when we looked at the claims and in association with temperature, there was an optimal temperature that we could identify when claims were lowest. So this was 25 degrees in Adelaide. So compared to 25 degrees, as you can see in this graph here, the risk certainly increases when the temperature increases. In fact, the risk increased 8% at 33 degrees and 30% at 40 degrees. So this is the risk of making a compensation claim for workplace injury or illness. Looking more closely at what type of illnesses and injuries occurred, it was burns, wounds, lacerations, heat illnesses, and in particular injuries to arms and legs. This was a mixed method study that was conducted. We also did surveys and interviews amongst people who had been injured, and they told us that dehydration and fatigue and headaches was very common when temperatures increased. They also told us that better PPE is needed, and in particular good supervision is advised. People need to be trained in health and safety and how to work safely in the heat, and in particular to be able to self-pace and to be able to have more rest breaks as needed. And we also surveyed health and safety professionals and health and safety reps, and they gave us a lot of information on this. And there was certainly a triangulation in our findings that we were hearing the same sort of things, and particularly about PPE and good supervision of staff is very important, allowing them to self-pace. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. We also did a qualitative study. So we actually talked to some people who had been injured in the heat or who have experience of working in the heat to give us a better understanding. Statistical analysis is wonderful and it gives us lots of information about who is at risk, but why they're at risk, I think you really need to ask people who are directly involved and the stakeholders. So I don't know if you can read some of these quotes here. The thermometer in the shed was reading 55 degrees, somebody said. Somebody who was working in the kitchen said that the kitchen thermostat is reading at between 60 and 70 degrees. Somebody else said the foreman's attitude was that if he stops work, don't bother coming back the next day. So this is the sort of thing that we were hearing. And I think this quote over on the right in particular sort of sums up what we were hearing in the surveys as well, that somebody said that an understanding from a boss's perspective that we're not machines, that we're humans, and humans have limitations. So this implies that people just can't work as normal when it's very hot. And I think this has implications for many of us who work in environmental health, that with climate change, temperatures going up, there are going to be days where it is just not safe for people to work, particularly if they're doing physical work outdoors. Could I have the next slide, please? So in conclusion, I don't want to go over time here, but in conclusion, the research that we've done has shown us that climate change is affecting environmental health in multiple ways. So what does this mean for people in the environmental health profession? Well, I guess you'd know that more than I would, but I would suspect that perhaps it might involve some more surveillance and monitoring, perhaps. Perhaps there'll be more risk assessments that are needed. But I'm pretty sure that we'll all have to adapt a bit more to the changing climate, and I think risk communication is going to be particularly important. And risk communication is something that has been a focus of some of our work, and we found in particular that people from multicultural backgrounds just weren't getting some of the communication messages. So I think this is going to be an important aspect. So that's where I'll finish today. So thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Hansen. That was a fantastic presentation. We'll go ahead and take any questions that may have come through, if there are any. Yep. All right, we'll start off with this question for you.
Okay, thank you for this question. This is about water quality. It's not something that I've been directly involved with at the University of Adelaide. When I was at Flinders University, there was a lot of work going on there on water quality. But certainly we know that with climate change, there'll be higher sea level, and there'll be more storms, there'll be droughts, there'll be floods, and all this does affect water quality, of course, both drinking water quality and recreational water quality. There could be greater pathogen loads in water, and also air pollution. If there's bushfires, there's likely to be bushfire ash perhaps going into reservoirs. So I think it's going to involve, I think, better monitoring of our water quality. Yes, our research has influenced health policy. Some of the research that's been done, particularly by Dr. Susan Williams, has been about threshold levels at what temperatures people do get sick or do end up in hospitals, or when mortality increases. And this research and these data that we've had has actually informed the South Australian heatwave warning system, which was put in place following the 2009 heatwave. And so we're quite proud that we have been able to contribute to that. I think SA Health has also put some interventions in place for people with mental health problems when heatwaves occur, following our research. And also, I mentioned risk communication beforehand. I think there's been increased risk communication, and I think particularly to people from multicultural backgrounds, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, who weren't getting heat health messages previously, and I think that's changed a bit now. So we're very proud of that.
And thank you very much for joining us this morning, Dr. Hansen. There's definitely some food for thought in the information that you've presented forward to us. Joining us next is Dr. Mingkai Jiang, an ecosystem ecologist and an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellow at the Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment, Western Sydney University. His work involves working with models and experiments to understand the impact of climate change on global terrestrial ecosystems and how that in turn affects ecosystem services and human society. Welcome, Dr. Jiang, and apologies if I'm not saying your last name correctly.
No, that's fine. My last name is should be pronounced Jiang, but that's fine. Yeah, thank you, Sam, for the opportunity. I need to just share my screen first. Thank you. So yeah, it's a really great opportunity for me to actually talk about climate change and plants on the Earth Day. So this is a really great opportunity. Thank you very much. And I want to take it just a little bit one step back away from what Dr. Hansen has talked about, which is more about the climate change direct effect on human health. So my topic is a little bit more broad about how climate change affects plants, and then in turn affects the planetary health, and then how that actually affects people's well-being. So yeah, I'm from Western Sydney University, and I'm currently a ARC DECRA Fellow and also a research fellow at the Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment. So before I really jump into the topic today, I want to give an just introduce this concept of Earth Overshoot Day. So this is just a reflection of the human's ecological footprint. As you can see, it's basically how people's demand for resources actually exceed the Earth's carrying capacity for each year. And from this figure, you can see very clearly that starting from the years 1970, we are actually consuming more resources than the Earth can provide each year. So, for example, in 1970, the Earth's overshoot day is basically December the 30th. But then gradually we're moving that day earlier and earlier. So currently in 2020, we're sitting at around 20th of August. So it takes about 1.6 Earth to support the resources we demand from the Earth each year for that year actually. So there are a lot of consequences, of course. And this relates to our central topic today, which is climate change. This figure shows the CO2 concentration level in the air that scientists reconstructed over the past 1 million years or so, well, actually 800,000 years. So there are, of course, fluctuations in these carbon dioxide levels, but strikingly, what you see really is that starting from the industrial period or the 1950, more specifically, the CO2 concentration level in the air actually is on the all-time or record high. So this period actually are described by some people as the Great Acceleration. So from almost all the variables you can name, ranging from the world population or the economic activity or the water use to the carbon dioxide level in the air, the methane emissions, or the forest loss, we can see a exponential increase pattern. So we are actually benefiting a lot from this period, but also we are emitting a lot of emissions, as well as using a lot of resources from nature. And some people are describing to identify the planetary boundary. Some people are actually try to quantify a range, a safety operating range, where for each particular concern we have, what's the space that we can operate without causing major damage to the environment. And one of that variable is climate change, of course. And we are actually on the edge of crossing the planetary boundary, meaning that we are reducing a lot the safety operating space that we can afford from the nature. And of course, climate change is real. We know that physics can lie. We put out a lot of carbon into the air. Of course, we are having consequences, and that consequence is reflected by climate. So we are warming the air, for example. This figure is a nice overview of what the carbon we're emitting into the air looks like over the past period, and what's the future scenarios will look like in the future. So there are multiple scenarios, economic scenarios. And if we follow the business as usual pathway, we are on the RCP 8.5 scenario. You can see the rate of carbon, the fossil fuel emissions is tremendously high. And that actually is relatively less if you look at the historical period ranging from 1950 to 2000. So we can't really relate the day-to-day weather events to climate change because things are operating much slower on translating climate change to a day-to-day weather variation. But the concerning pattern is that for the future period, we are going to see a lot higher rate of climate change, and therefore we are going to possibly see more extreme weather events, for example. And that will have huge consequences for human health and as well as vegetation, of course. So basically, my research is to understand how will climate change affect us through its effect on natural vegetation. That means that we need to have a better understanding of how nature works and to identify the vulnerability, resilience, and feedbacks that vegetation provide to mitigate and interact with climate change. And also, there's also very important policy implication or people's implication is how can we do something about it? So we want to reduce the uncertainty as well as to provide options to develop sustainably. So I want to focus today on one key aspect of plants, which is photosynthesis. I'm sure you know this already. So photosynthesis is a process for plants to take up carbon from the atmosphere. And in that process, plants grow, it produces sugar, and then it also releases oxygen to support life on Earth. So photosynthesis is really a key cornerstone process on Earth. And there are multiple factors affecting photosynthesis. So one of that is temperature. And this figure shows a typical temperature response figure where photosynthesis is responding to changes in temperature. And then the two lines are basically a typical C3 and C4 plant response. What you see is that as temperature increases at a relatively low temperature range, leaf photosynthesis actually increase. So basically increased temperature is benefiting plants in terms of carbon uptake. But there's an optimal range. And beyond that range, photosynthesis drops quite dramatically. And you will see that in the future, for example, on the climate change, photosynthesis will drop eventually. And that will have consequences on how vegetation is uptaking carbon and mitigating the effects of climate change. And this figure is very general, but there are different species have different response. Some species can have a very narrow optimal range of temperature, and some species can have a lower optimum temperature. So we are talking about different species response, and some species might be outcompeted by other species under the influence of climate change. Another possible variable affecting photosynthesis is the CO2 concentration level in the air. So again, these are the two classic response curves where the plants, the C3 and C4 plants are exposed to different level of CO2 concentration in the air. So again, you see that there's a nonlinear response function. So photosynthesis actually increase a little bit, increase linearly with increasing air, but increasing CO2 concentration in the air. But as the CO2 concentration in the air increase further, the level of photosynthesis actually saturate. So in the future, as we continue to emit more carbon dioxide into the air, we will see that the benefits for plants to absorb carbon will be gradually reduced. So the plants will not take as much carbon as it would take in the historic period if they are going to take carbon dioxide from the future. So again, that will have huge impact and feedbacks to how vegetation is going to buffer climate change in the future. And what you see from this figure, this is a very nice overview and animation to demonstrate the role of plants in buffering the rate of climate change. This is basically showed like a heartbeat of human being, but in this case, it's just the plants absorbing carbon from the air and grow on a seasonal pattern, a seasonal variation pattern. So plants are actually offering a lot of benefits to mitigate the climate change. And there are studies that synthesize at the global scale what plants contribute in terms of carbon dioxide uptake. I'm not sure whether you can see the figures, but here basically gross photosynthesis from land plants is taking up about 123 petagram of carbon per year. And if you consider the total respiration flux, which is about 118 petagram of carbon per year, so the net land flux uptaking carbon is about 2.6 petagram of carbon per year. And that is in the context of about 7.8 petagram of carbon that is emitted per year by fossil fuel combustions. So it's 1/3 of human emissions are actually taken up by land plants on an annual basis. So we are basically contributing a lot from the plant's perspective to offset the rate of climate change. And in addition to that, plants are also offering a lot of other ecosystem services. For example, it can regulate climate via its exchange of water with the air, and it can also provide a lot of food production, timber production, as well as it has cultural values such as recreational value and educational values. So in the future, climate change are happening on a much higher rate compared to the historic period. And this is a projection for the period of 2070 to 2100, comparing to the 1960 to 1990 values. You can see there's a huge difference in mean annual temperature over that comparison. And there are a lot of consequences in the Earth's climate system, and strikingly, some of those are causing tipping point behaviors. For example, there are diebacks in the Amazon rainforest or in the high latitude forests, and there are influences on how ENSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, is affecting climate in the mid latitude region and low latitude region, for example, in Australia. So, in terms of climate risks, the Paris Agreement aims to limit the rate of global warming to no more than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level. And best of all, it tries to further limit the global warming by no more than 1.5 degrees compared to the pre-industrial values. There are huge differences between the two targets. For example, in terms of extreme weather, the 1.5 degree value target means that there will be a 100% increase in flood risk. That's already very high. But if you compare the 2 degree target, that's about 170% increase in flood risk. So what we achieve in terms of the target of the Paris Agreement means a lot to human health and to the natural vegetation that supports our ecosystem services. So a natural question that arises is that what would you choose? I think that the answer to that question is relatively easy, right? We want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. But a follow-up question really, I think, is a little bit more complicated. What would you do to support that choice? So I think that question, the answer to that question is very complicated and involves a lot of scientific evidence, but it also involves a lot of decisions from people. So I will stop here and take any questions you.
Thank you very much, Mingkai. I mean, I know what I would choose. We'll leave it up to those in power to see what they choose. We'll open up for questions now. So if anyone has any questions, please comment below.
I read the question: how will climate change affect vegetation's ability to sequester carbon? So in my talks, I show that two figures, right? How the temperature rise and CO2 concentration rise affect plants. So things are a little bit more complicated because climate change doesn't mean that we are only increasing temperature or only increasing CO2 concentration. We are also affecting how climate extreme, for example, the heat, and how drought patterns affect the vegetation response as well. So in terms of temperature and CO2 concentration, of course, currently we're taking a lot of benefits from vegetation because the increase in temperature and CO2 concentration are actually benefiting plants. So plants are actually absorbing more than we are expecting. But in the future, they are going to significantly reduce their ability because of the further rise in temperature, and CO2 concentration doesn't really yield the same benefits, marginal benefits, as what it should provide in the historic period. And in addition to that, we are actually changing the water cycle as well. So a lot of drought mortality events will potentially happen. And therefore, I think it's complicated. Climate change will affect vegetation ability to sequester carbon. And I think in the future, more likely it will reduce the vegetation's ability to sequester carbon. But the exact magnitude depends on the location as well as the magnitude of the climate change. The overshoot for 2020, the green was much higher for 2020 and not in line with continued decrease for the previous years. Was it because of COVID, less demand? Yeah, I think that that actually show very clear pattern effect of the COVID, because we are actually demanding slightly less. Our economic activity were significantly dampened. But what you can see actually really compared to 2019 was that we don't really see a huge reduction in demand. So that also highlights the importance of the legacy effects. So even though we stopped, we stopped activity completely, we could potentially there will be carryover effects on the climate, and therefore it will continue to overexplore the resources that the Earth is providing to us. Is there any type of vegetation that can absorb carbon at a higher rate? Yes, I think different species are showing different rate of carbon dioxide absorption. So that's one of the key research frontier in plant science, at least, because we want to identify the possibilities of using different plants to absorb carbon. But the real issue is that a lot of carbon dioxide, a lot of different plants are showing different responses to CO2 concentration rise as well as to temperature rise. So we need to understand not only the individual response, but also the interactive and combined response. So that means that we need to study not only the individual response of individual plants, but also the individual response of plant responding to different environmental factors, as well as how plants grow together to respond to different environmental change. Because plants are competing with each other, and they also can facilitate each other. So again, the answer to this question is complicated, and we are still trying to figure out.
Thank you very much again for your time today, Dr. Mingkai. I will definitely be thinking about what I can do as opposed to what I want to do.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Sam. Lovely to be with you all today on Earth Day, which is a very special day. Can I just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I'm in Perth, and also pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I think this is a very important acknowledgement, but it's also a very important framing for the challenge we've got ahead of us. I've learned a lot from hearing Dr. Hansen and Dr. Jiang. And it seems to me that that kind of scientific knowledge is not just important, but we've also seen the bridge to excellent risk communication and changes in policy and hopefully action. And I will talk a bit about the Climate Health WA inquiry, but also give a challenge to the Environmental Health Association as an organisation, and also to you as members on today, Earth Day. In terms of that follow-up action. The Climate Health Inquiry was unique in that we had a year to look in detail at the health impacts of climate change in Western Australia. And I was able to talk to a lot of experts. I'm not an expert in this area, I've talked to a lot of experts, and then draw that together into a story about Western Australia in the final report. And we did write that report in order to be read by non-experts. And I would encourage you at least to go to the executive summary and just Google Climate Health WA inquiry. And a lot of work went into creating a clear story, which hopefully does justice to the facts and the information and the data from climate science, but also to all the people who talk to us, both through submissions, through public forums, through formal hearings, and then creates a story and hopefully energizes a set of partnerships to create change now post-inquiry. And there's 10 simple findings and 10 simple recommendations, both on mitigation and on adaptation, which the government has accepted in principle and now looking to implement. We moved away from the overall message that climate change is real, because the state government had already said that in commissioning our inquiry, to the couple of clear messages, which is climate change is happening now, and it's happening here in Western Australia in these specific ways. So just living in Australia over the last couple of years, we've seen bushfires devastate mainly the east coast of Australia. We've then seen floods the following year. And just recently, we've seen this cyclone crossing the coast much further south in Perth. And we wrote about this in our climate report. And just drawing the evidence together, scientists told us that cyclones would become less frequent but more intense, and that with the passage of time, these cyclones would cross the coast further south, likely to. Now, the West Australian coast, the area around Port Hedland, Karratha, is the area which has the most number of cyclone crossings for the whole of Australia in terms of the coast. So even more than in Queensland. But we're not used to seeing cyclones cross 800 kilometres north of Perth and Kalbarri. So that was a lot further south. So the evidence in terms of the impacts are right before our eyes. And then we described in the inquiry all the different regional impacts in Western Australia, not just the heat in the north, but in the cyclones in the Pilbara, but also the really strong impacts of coastal erosion where most people live along the coast, bushfires in the goldfields, the effects of decreasing rainfall and drought in our agricultural regions, the effects on biodiversity in the southwest, what impact that's having on people's mental health as well as physical health, and then diminishing water supplies in the Great Southern. So this is a huge state. It's a wonderful state to live in, but we're seeing the impacts, and people are telling us the stories of how that's affecting them at the moment. I will just make one point. So we, in terms of adaptation, the environmental health workforce is the workforce that deals with this. You have been dealing with this for decades, and I would say you have all the health professional groups, you have the most knowledge, you have the most commitment to this area, and you can make a huge amount of difference, but you need to do some things differently as an association, as members, and that's the challenge I'll be putting out in Western Australia. So we made some specific recommendations around early warning systems, but there was also national things that have been on the agenda for a very long time, such as integrated data systems that link the environment and health, that NHealth as a national committee, for example, has been looking at for 15, 20 years and has never got going. So the question is, how do you take all this information and how do you create new partnerships in order to drive change? And I think some of the clues about what those new partnerships might be were talked to us by the scientists just now. So when Dr. Hansen talked about heat and the effect on occupational health and safety, clearly unions should be key in this, in the partnerships. Equally, many of you will work in local government, and the local government sector has been very vocal, and different local governments have done a lot, particularly in our coastal regions, to look at adaptation to climate change, and they have very strong plans. So could there be more of an organisational link between our local government associations and the Environmental Health Association? So there's many different partnerships that, of course, with the Public Health Association, which I'm the national president of, we welcome these new partnerships, and at all levels. The key question, I think, is just as much what can we do. The other key question is how much time do we have? And if we reverse that question and ask ourselves honestly, how committed are we to this? How much time do we have? Then we ask ourselves, how do we best use that time, even if it's limited? And it might not be on leading something, on doing something new, but on just linking up at an individual level or supporting other people in your community or in making these new partnerships. But we must do something, either an individual, a community, or organizational level. If we continue to do what we're doing, the story of the last 10 years, which has basically been a wasted decade, will be the story of the next 10 years. And that would be a tragedy for the reasons Dr. Jiang said, which is the difference between 1.5 and 2 is enormous, and every 0.1 degree does make a difference. So this is a call for action. It's a call for being honest about how much time we have and thinking then through the best ways we can use it. It's an opportunity for the environment health profession to get some of its long-standing agenda items heard and acted on. So there's many things that you have been asking for many, many years that may be able to be looked at and get supported and done now with this new lens that we put on of environment and climate change. So my ending questions to you are, suggestion is, please look at the Climate Health WA inquiry. There's a lot of material in there. It's a year's worth and very, very comprehensive and simple, and you can get the bits you want. You don't have to read all of it. Workforce is our strength. Workforce is the way we're going to address this issue, but in new ways with new partnerships. So how much time do you have, and who will you partner with? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tarun. That was a really interesting presentation on what's been happening. And I think you've raised a few questions and got a few people thinking about what they need to be doing in order to adapt themselves. So we'll go ahead and open up for questions now.
While the questions are coming in, Sam, I might just say that the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector contributed marvellously to our inquiry. There's whole sections in our report about the Aboriginal perspective on climate change. So they're seeing the same kinds of impacts, you know, ranges in the north, etc., and across all the different areas of Western Australia. This is something that they've cared about. They've stewarded our continent for 60,000 years or 3,000 generations. And there's a perspective there that we haven't been able to bring to our mainstream thinking. We're struggling to think forward 10 years or half a generation. One of the people who talked to us said, we want our future to stretch as far ahead of us as our past does behind us. That's an incredible challenge to us as Australians. So the other sector to engage with and partner with is the Aboriginal community control sector, whether that's health, land, environment, whichever. Thank you. Thank you. How do you feel environmental health professionals should work to move forward and adapt? I think you're the experts. So there's 100 ideas in the climate health inquiry, and there's no shortage of options for you. You know, there's so many policy statements, position statements, there's so many networks to tap into. And the one and the most biggest supportive network is the Climate and Health Alliance in Australia. I'm pretty sure Environmental Health Australia would already be partnered into that, but it's a wealth of resources. So I'm not going to say what you should do. I'd say be honest and do something that you can do and you can do uniquely. And even if you don't know what to do, ask the person sitting next to you or email someone or say, how can I support you? So we need the champions of change. And I was at a launch of the WA Country Health Services Environment and Sustainability Framework this week, and they call for champions. But we also need those of us who may not be champions to be supportive and to give the space to the champions and then get behind them and cover them and get that stuff on our agendas, even if we're not the drivers. So we don't always need to drive and to lead, but we do need to support at all times. And there's lots of people out there, especially young people, who are so committed to this. And maybe we need to change our structures of power and give more agency to those younger people. Just again, I'll just talk while you're waiting for that. I mean, the other thing for Environmental Health Australia is to get into, somehow find a way to get into that discussion about the post-COVID recovery and what that looks like. You've got a perspective here, and Dr. Jiang talked about the planetary health perspective of all the health professionals, you are the most able to talk about, integrating the theory with the practice as environmental health professionals. It's an amazing discipline, which is both theoretical and practical at the same time. And you can bridge those planetary issues more than anyone else can.
Absolutely. I might have to leave it at that. I'm sorry, Leah. If you do have a question, please email me through or send a comment, and I will forward it through to Tarun to reply later. All right. Thank you again, Tarun, for coming on and joining us today. It's been a real pleasure having you.
Thanks, Sam.
And that concludes our Earth Day live chat this year. I hope everyone enjoyed this event as much as I did, and maybe even learnt something new. I know there's been a lot of questions raised, and we'll certainly have some time to think about it this year. I want to take this opportunity to again thank all of our fantastic speakers for taking the time out today to be part of our live chat and to share their knowledge and experiences with everyone. A recording of this chat will be made available via the EHA website and YouTube channel in the coming days. So keep an eye on the EHA social media channels for the announcement. Lastly, if you would like more information on environmental health, EHOs, or EHA, visit the Environmental Health Australia website by going to www.eh.org.au. Thank you for joining us today, and everyone have a fantastic Earth Day. Bye now.